Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where around the world you are. I'd like to welcome everyone to another webinar from the Global Prison Abolition Coalition. My name is Edward Wong. I'm from Lausanne Collective and the Global Prison Abolition Coalition. Our event today is scheduled from 1 to 2:30, but depending on our conversation, we may go over. So to start us off, I'm going to give us a brief introduction of our work here at GPAC before handing it over to our moderator. So GPAC was formed a little over half a year ago, a coalition of dozens of abolitionist organizations spanning 5 continents and many more individual scholars, artists, writers, and activists. Our formation was really sparked by the current pandemic, in addition to the broader political climate, which has created great urgency in fighting for the abolition of the global capitalist carceral system. We recognize that this is a unique political moment where abolitionists and resistance struggles have sprung up all around the world, and really sees it as our mission to reinforce and connect these global struggles while opposing all forms of imperialisms and authoritarianisms. We have coalesced around 7 key demands. So number 1, to advocate for the immediate release of prisoners based on restorative justice and transformative justice practices. Number 2, to advocate for safe housing, healthcare, necessities, and documentation for all, including migrants and refugees. 3, to create platforms to publicize the cases of political and social prisoners and the forcibly disappeared, many of whom have been tortured by repressive states and militias. Number 4, to oppose execution and torture, including police brutality and murder. Number 5, to oppose the exploitation of prisoners as laborers. Number 6, to promote the debate on an alternative society free of alienated labor and the logic of capital, where decisions can be based on thoughtful deliberation and centered on the well-being of humanity and nature and community-based within an international network of cooperation. Finally, last but not least, number 7, we imagine and work towards a world without prisons, detention centers, camps, asylums, borders, and other forms of captivity. To follow our work, please look for us on social media, so on Facebook, on Twitter, search for World Without Prisons, or visit our website at www.worldwithoutprisons.org. You can see the link scrolling below. We will also be live tweeting this event, so if you want some text accompaniments, please visit us on our Twitter. We'll have someone tweet something out shortly. So now, without further ado, I'd like to present our moderator, Mahavish Ahmad. Mahavish studies state violence, targeted communities, and movements that resist, especially in Pakistan. She is the assistant professor in human rights and politics at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where she's completing a book focused on the history and experiences of state destruction in Pakistan's Salvan province of Balochistan. She has earlier been a lecturer at the Lahore University of Management Science and the Quadi-e-Azam University, and worked as a journalist covering military and insurgent violence in the Pakistan-Afghanistan region. She also co-founded the bilingual Urdu and English magazine Tanqeed.org, TANQEED.org, with Madiha Tahir. So welcome, Mahavish, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Ed. And thank you to GPAC, the fantastic speakers that we have with us today that I'll be introducing really shortly, Ather, Vincent, and Ahmad, and to all of you who have joined our session. Today is the start publicly of an important set of conversations, an attempt, an effort to bring 2 separated struggles into conversation. One is the struggle against enforced disappearances, and with that, arrests, torture, and killings by states around the world, especially states like India, Egypt, China, Turkey, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and many, many others. And the second is the prison and police abolitionist movement, out of which GPAC has emerged, that we have seen reignited by activist scholars, by Black radical thought, and in the wake of Black Lives Matter protests in the US. Recent events remind us of how urgent it is to bring these two conversations together. In Hong Kong, over the last few days, China's new national security laws have led to the arrests of over 50 pro-democracy activists in the last few days. Uyghurs in a southwestern part of China remain incarcerated in mass numbers in concentration camps. In Pakistan, where I work, leading members of the Pashtun defense movement, the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, a grassroots movement against state violence, arguably one of the most important in the country today, their members and leaders have been arrested, including a member of parliament. Meanwhile, minority communities are not receiving the kind of protection that they need as militants attack them. In Turkey, President Erdogan has arrested over 30 students protesting crackdowns on academic freedom at Istanbul's Bogazizi University. And in Kashmir and in Egypt, political prisoners and journalists remain incarcerated. Of course, also one of the really important recent events that I think all of us have been following has been in the US, where we've seen how police has stood by while white supremacists have stormed Congress. And we've all known, even Joe Biden and lots of mainstream commentators, that if those protesters or people in front were Black, they would have been treated very, very differently. So what the purpose of sort of listing these events, and there's so many more that I could list, the purpose of it is really that they're a reminder that there's a constant onslaught of imperial state and majoritarian violence that political dissidents and racialized and minoritized communities around the world continue to face. The fact that they are constantly taking place at the same time is a reminder, and one of the main reasons that we've decided to get together today, because it's time for us to think and organize comparatively and collectively. The first reason to do that is because we know in our conversations, and we know when we sort of manage to raise our heads up above the necessity, a lot of us who work with various missing persons movement or movements against state violence are usually overwhelmed by the important organizing we need to do just to help somebody get released. But we know that the truth is that many of the regimes that are behind the state violence share and trade in technologies of violence, in technologies of incarceration, including surveillance and weapons, know-how and intelligence, training for soldiers and policemen alike. Now, abolitionists in the US know that they cannot end or abolish prisons and policing without ending global American empire. And those of us outside of the US know the role that US empire has played, along with several other imperialisms and regional imperialisms, played in pumping up the states that perpetrate these atrocities. So take a place like Pakistan, where I'm engaged with, their enforced disappearances have led to several thousands of people going missing. And they're a direct outgrowth of post 9/11 demand by George W. Bush to Pakistan's then military ruler to deliver suspect militants. This demand generated a network of detention centers and Black sites that the Pakistani military regime now uses against political dissident and minoritized groups like Pashtuns, Baloch, and Sindhis. That's why a lot of us online, if you're following some of the commentary after this event in front of Congress yesterday, are reacting quite critically to a liberal horror at an American president inciting violence against the people of the United States, as represented by Congress. We know that this attack on American democracy is not really a break, but a continuation of a global American policy of inciting violence on the people of the world and the democracies that they have tried to fight for. The other reason that we think it's important to think of these various places and communities targeted in state violence together is that we really need one another. Our efforts to resist state violence in whichever way that may be as part of a movement, as scholars, as individual activists, as artists, our efforts to resist disappearances and arbitrary arrest, incarceration, torture, state killings, they need to be connected to one another so that we can strengthen one another's efforts. So to loosely quote Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, critique and analysis is important, but it's not enough, and we need to organize collectively. One of the biggest techniques of state violence is to divide and rule, to make sure that we never know about one another, and sometimes to pit us against each other. And this event today is an opportunity to bring different people involved in different parts of the world together to start discussing some of these issues. Now, as I started off by saying, we're primarily going to focus on enforced disappearances and resistance to it on the one hand, and on abolitionist politics as it's emerged, especially out of the Black radical tradition. As it stands now, enforced disappearances, if you look at a lot of the struggles happening around the world, they're primarily a practice that we hear about taking place, outside of the Western world. Though often it's been with Western support and often for the benefit of Western countries, as we have seen, 20 years ago when the US government was asking for extraordinary renditions. Resistance to it, however, often takes place through a kind of liberal human rights framework where missing persons movements are forced to go to courts run by the very state that have disappeared their loved ones, asking that state to uphold laws or at most reform them. And while there are some attempts by various missing persons movements to work together, often through the UN or other collaborative international bodies, most of these movements are overwhelmed by the everyday labor of holding protest camps and running back and forth from these courts and making sure that more loved ones are not disappeared for them to even have a chance to even speak to one another and hear from one another. The abolitionist movement, meanwhile, has emerged especially out of the US, especially out of the fantastic organizing that's been happening there, really at the heart of American empire among persecuted communities, Black communities and other communities of color. Their call, that's why they really ignited, I think, political imaginations, has been not to reform laws, not to just do reformist work, but really to abolish the prison, to abolish the police, to recognize the ongoing policy of incarceration as deeply linked to deeper structural issues around racial capitalism and settler colonialism. The insights of the abolitionist movement has prompted us all to continue to deepen our analysis how state violence is linked to race and capitalism, patriarchy, caste, empire, etc. And there is some really interesting and fascinating work that our comrades over in the US have done as they've begun to trace the way that American policing is linked to American militarism and American imperial expeditions. But there's so much work still, so much collective and collective thinking that we need to do about how it is that the insights of the abolitionist movement applies to places like India and Egypt and Pakistan and China, and how and whether and to what extent the political vocabularies of abolition, which are in English, can also spread and circulate and make sense or not make sense in various different ways in places around the world. So today, we're going to have a chance to think through some of these opportunities, some of these challenges of beginning to link and think about various sites of state violence, of imperial sovereign and majoritarian violence around the world for the purposes of strengthening our analysis of how it is that incarceration and state violence functions, but also for the purposes of strengthening linkages, alliances, and solidarities between them. And we'll be hearing from three very fantastic speakers. First, the first speaker we'll be hearing from, and I'm now finally finished with my own introduction, we'll be hearing from Vincent, Wong, Ather, and Ahmed Said. I will just allow myself to briefly introduce each of them. Vincent Wong is a PhD candidate at Osgoode Hall Law School, where he researches barriers to education for undocumented youth from a critical race perspective. He's also a research associate at the African American Policy Forum, a board member of the Community Justice Collective, Takaranto, I think, and a member of the Lausanne Collective, a leftist group of writers, researchers, activists, and artists from Hong Kong and its diaspora. And they have a fantastic website that I would really recommend everybody to go and check out. Vincent Wong will be thinking, I believe, both about the recent arrests in Hong Kong, but very importantly, when it comes to incarceration, around Uyghur communities incarcerated by China. Then we'll have Ather, a political anthropologist, a poet, short fiction writer, and a columnist. She teaches at the University of Northern Colorado, Greeley. Ather is an author of a fantastic book that I would also recommend you read, Resisting Disappearance, Military Occupation, and Women's Activism in Kashmir. And she's the co-editor of Can You Hear Kashmiri Women Speak? Resisting Occupation in Kashmir and A Desolation Called Peace. She's published a poetry collection, The Frame, and another collection is forthcoming. Ather's ethnographic poetry on Kashmir has won an award from the Society for Humanistic Anthropology. She is the founder-editor of Kashmir Lit and is a co-founder of Critical Kashmir Studies Collective, an interdisciplinary network of scholars working on the Kashmir region. And as you can hear, Ather will be speaking about the situation in Kashmir. Finally, the last speaker, and you'll get to see him soon as well, Ahmed Said is an Egyptian anti-authoritarian leftist, a human rights advocate, a poet, a writer, and a consultant surgeon. He was also a former prisoner himself a few years back, where he spent 1 year in maximum security prison following enforced disappearance and torture. Currently, he's a member of the Bundestag Program, Parlamentarian, Protect Parlamentarian, and the coordinator for the Egyptian Commission for Rights and Freedoms in Germany. This is in addition to his role as coordinator and producer in the MENA Prison Forum initiative, as well as the co-founder and executive manager of Open Data Bank. So welcome to our speakers. The way that we're going to run the rest of the session is I'm going to ask all of the speakers 2 sets of questions. The first ones will be about the technologies of incarceration and violence in each of their sites and some of the histories and context of that. And the second one about solidarities. So let me start with you, Vincent. And this is a question obviously for everybody. So I'm just going to say it once and then ask Vincent to go first. So I'd like each of you to tell us a little bit about how enforced disappearances, incarceration, and state violence takes place in each of your respective places. What's the broader political context and history of this violence? What methods and technologies of violence are used? We've learned so much about the American prison. We've all been educating ourselves thanks to the brilliant work of our comrades in the US. But what does incarceration look like in the site that you think and work with? And finally, who is racialized and othered through violence? What are the cultural techniques of rendering these populations disposable? So I'll hand it over to you, Vincent.
Great. Thanks so much, Mahavish. And thank you for GPAC for organizing this and all of you for joining us. This is such an exciting panel because, you know, when you mentioned the kind of divide and rule logic that continues to justify so many of these carceral systems, and just being in community, being in discussion with each other starts breaking down the very power that these discourses have to justify their systems. So first of all, you know, I want to situate myself a little bit. You know, my name is Vincent Wong. I'm a Han Chinese Hong Konger that is living as a settler on Turtle Island in lands claimed by the Canadian settler colonial state. But you know, are the traditional lands and continue to be the lands of many different indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. The second thing is, like, I am not Uyghur, right? I'm Han Chinese, or part of other ethnic groups that are being directly affected by mass incarceration and dispossession in this region, right? So I have to recognize that subjectivity when I start talking about enforced disappearances and carceral systems in this region and the limits of those of that subjectivity. Second, I want to talk really quickly about the naming politics. So some of the, you might have noticed in the event description that Xinjiang was in quotation marks. And I just want to explain that a little bit, and that the region that we're talking about is essentially the large northwestern frontier of China, or the Chinese state. And it's huge. It's like 2.5 times like the size of Texas, I guess. And we put the quotation marks to really denote the political contestation of that name and to foreground the various attempts by the Chinese state to either create a vassal state similar to, you know, Tibet and Korea during imperial times, or direct colonizing, settler colonizing, and subjugation of the area that has gone over time and including now. And so Xinjiang has actual colonial meanings. Xinjiang means new frontier in Chinese, right? And that should signify something as well. There are other alternative names. I won't get into like the different kind of specific naming politics of them, but it's commonly referred to as East Turkestan. There were actually 2 East Turkestan republics, one very short-lived in 1933 to 34, and a bit of a longer one from 1944 to 1949. And other names include Uyghuristan, Dzungaria, Tarim Basin. So there are two halves of it. One is Dzungaria in the north and Tarim Basin in the south. Okay, and you mentioned the question about who is targeted by these pretty brutal systems of mass incarceration and carceral violence. It's primarily Uyghur, the predominant non-Han ethnicity of Xinjiang, due to indigenous land claims that they have, but also energized by religious, ethnic, and racial differences that are increasingly weaponized by the Chinese state as security risks, right? So the very bodies are now being represented as security risks along with their culture and ideologies. And it also targets others who are, kind of perceived to be Uyghur or are indigenous non-Han. So this includes Kazakhs, Kyrgyz people, Tajiks, Mongols, Pamiris, and Hui to a lesser extent. Now, how and why did this develop? So this is really, really important, right? Because a lot of people have not really heard about this region until the situation kind of blew up in 2017. And so it seems a lot into many readers' minds that this kind of popped out of nowhere. It definitely did not pop out of nowhere. This has been a slow brew. And the current horrific manifestations of oppression is like a Frankenstein of different factors that has accelerated in the mid-2010s. So those factors include inequality, right? Economic inequality and inequality of opportunity between Han and primarily Uyghur, but other non-Han kind of indigenous ethnicities. That there's a lack of real de facto political autonomy, right? There's been a long history of sort of Uyghur government leaders, but actually are controlled by Han interests in the CCP. So China has kind of a parallel government where you have CCP, Chinese Communist Party leaders that hold the actual power, and then you have the government state officials, right? And the next one is kind of like an economic development and resource extraction that started in the 1990s that result in significant Uyghur dispossession. And the third is a sort of a massive state-sanctioned Han migration to the region. First in the north, where there was actually sort of a paramilitary permanent settlement. It's called the Bingtuan. They're kind of economic and military settlements for former army people, so People Liberation Army, that has like coalesced into these permanent settlements. And then later, there's been Han migration more into the southern part of Xinjiang, which is primarily Uyghur dominated. So again, so why did this develop, right? Like what accounts for these sort of massive million-plus people kind of concentration camps system that is being talked about now? And I would say that even before 9/11, there was a serious concern on part of the Chinese state after the fall of the USSR and independent states in Central Asia that Xinjiang might go in that direction as well. So there was a tightening system of control on religious worship and practice that was happening, and separatism became a big concern of the Chinese state after the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, in 9/11, after when 9/11 happened, what that allowed the Chinese state to do, and many other states, is shift that discourse of separatism to terrorism, right? And several sort of instances of political violence that were some of the perpetrators were Uyghur, allowed the Chinese state to justify that discourse and justify the crackdown that we see now. And then the last portion that you kind of asked me to talk about is the logics and methods of carceral violence, including enforced disappearances. And I'll go through this a little bit because I think it's very important, the manifestation of what we see. So enforced disappearance under international law basically has three elements. It has a deprivation of liberty against, the will of the person. So that's obvious. The involvement of government officials, right, at least by acquiescence. And the third part is probably what distinguishes it as enforced disappearances, which is the refusal to acknowledge the deprivation of liberty or the concealment of the fate or whereabouts of those people, right? And that's where most of actually the detentions that are happening in Xinjiang are actually forced disappearances. The government knows exactly where they are, right? But they don't really tell the families as leverage, right, to keep it part of the discipline. And so they conceal much of this information for leverage. And so from the perspective of the families, they are disappeared. But from the perspective of the state authorities, they know exactly where they are, right? And there are three interrelated segments of carcerality. I won't get into them because I'm running low on time. But one is essentially the open air prison, right? It's a predictive grid policing system, and I can talk a little bit more about that, which uses a very AI-enabled policing grid system to sort people in neighborhoods of low risk, medium risk, high risk, essentially. And if you're high risk, that's where the state will start acting and curtailing your liberties or putting you into the extrajudicial camps. The second part, and the one that is almost never talked about, is a formal prison system. So this is people that actually go through the carceral justice system, including pretrial detention. So if, according to official sources, reportedly 230,000 individuals in Xinjiang were sentenced in 2017 and 2018 alone, which is like a over tenfold increase from previous years. So that's kind of the increase in formal carceration. And then the third one that is more talked about is these extrajudicial detention camps or vocational centers, as the government will call it. And this is where the predictive policing model leads if you're high risk. And it has two functions, essentially, a forced assimilation and political indoctrination function, sort of like an Indian residential school, right, to eliminate the Uyghur inside the individual, right, in forced assimilation. And the second one is more of a coercive labor function. So allowing the exploitation and dispossession of these people creates a easily exploitable labor force that can work in factories that have been actually identified within some of the internment camps, but also allows those workers to be shipped to graduate from the re-education camps and be coercively transferred to Eastern Chinese cities to work in factories. And that those factories have been identified in the global supply chains of many multinational companies like Apple, Nike, and Gap. So that's already a lot. Those three kind of parts of the carceral system work together, and that gives you sort of an understanding of how carcerality and enforced disappearances happen in Xinjiang. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Vincent. And in a prior conversation, Vincent and I have talked about how the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which really starts up in Kashmir and in Xinjiang, goes all the way from there down through Pakistan. And at its very end, there is enforced disappearances of the Baloch community in southern Pakistan. And there's such important collective thinking that we need to do along that corridor and the disappearances happening along them. Ahmed Said has joined us, and we are very happy. Everybody can now see his face. But Ahmed, before I call on you, I am going to ask Ather to share a couple of thoughts around Kashmir and around these similar questions that Vincent spoke about.
Thank you, Mahavish, and thank you everyone for organizing this event and including a conversation on Kashmir. I would like to address the broader political context that you asked. So thinking about carceral politics in Kashmir, I think we have to shift our vantage a little bit. And Vincent touched upon the fact that after 2001, it's become so easy to lump everything as global terrorism, and especially if it's a Muslim community that's involved in a particular struggle, suddenly it becomes quote unquote a terrorism problem, and that it's become very easy to subsume and sideline Kashmir as a terrorism issue, even though it's not one. And I think that's something that international community needs to shift their vantage on, and India has been particularly successful in the last 72 years and increasingly since 2001 to sideline Kashmir as a terrorism issue, stereotypically, quote unquote, the Islamic terrorism issue. So when we shift our lens, we also are able to look at Kashmir from 1947 onwards, and even before 1947, before India and Pakistan became two nations, as not a problem of territory, as not a problem of quote unquote borders, but as a problem of a people who are seeking sovereignty and who are also seeking a choice, whether they want to go with Pakistan, whether they want to be independent. There is a small section that has always sided with India, and those are the client politicians that have been used since 1947 to carry India's water inside Kashmir. So those are some of the things that we need to keep in mind. And thinking about carceral politics inside Kashmir and how India has handled Kashmir. If you look at any government policy, or you look at interlocutors who talk about Kashmir in India, they will always talk about handling Kashmir. And in that, imprisonment, detainment, and carceral politics has been very, very, very important. In 2019, what we saw was the unilateral de-operationalization of Kashmir's autonomy, which was granted within the Indian constitution as Article 370. It was unilaterally taken away from people. And a lot of people are kind of thinking about, is it a good thing or a bad thing? It is a bad thing because it takes Kashmir, the territorial sovereignty from Kashmiris. But we also have to understand how Article 370 was actually used to how it was used to criminalize the Kashmiri movement and create more and more room for criminalization and incarceration. So in 1947, what happens is when the client politicians inside Kashmir, they have been prepared to side with India, and they are the ones who are kind of at that time able to establish a relationship with India. And we also see that there is a war that happens in 1947. The moment that these two countries declare their independence and declare themselves as countries, they go to war on Kashmir. And not only Kashmir, there are several other inflammations around different borders as well, but Kashmir was predominant. And then what also happens in 1949, that there is between the client politicians and India, there is an establishment of a relationship, which was the semi-autonomy, which was granted to Kashmiris. But plebiscite or referendum was still on the table, and Kashmiris in every decade have been waiting for that to happen. But India has more or less subsumed that, sidelined that, and wanted, from the moment it made Kashmir international by taking it to the United Nations. After that, the most of the things that India has done is to kind of like de-internationalize it, make it into more of an internal disturbance sort of a situation, and even a law and order situation, and of course, quote unquote terrorism. But then what we see in 1949 happening, and that's very important for us to understand, because we are talking about prison abolition, we are talking about carceral politics. The moment Article 370 happens, also there are some presidential statutes that Article 370 becomes a Trojan horse for India to put inside Kashmir, and that now it can pass some of the laws or more important laws that it wants implemented inside Kashmir. And one of the most important ones is preventive detention. So after 1949, what we see is even the client politician who sided with India, who took the mantle of carrying India's water inside Kashmir, we see him detained in a coup. There is no other word for it but a coup, because at that time he was the prime minister of Kashmir under the semi-autonomy and autonomous system. He was detained in 1953. He was thrown off from power, and he was detained. And for the next 22 years, he was in and out of, for 11 long years, he was in the jail, and then he was also incarcerated time and again. And this is what we see happening with even the client politicians. So because preventive detention was made, not that he was under that particular clause, but preventive detention, even through him, was made very focused, was made the focal point of criminalizing the resistance movement inside Kashmir. It was institutionalized, so to speak. And now what we can see, the way we see the laws and the statutes that are implemented inside Kashmir, they have been analyzed by India's own analysts in line with what they see as colonial constitutionalism. And some of the legal scholars have talked about Kashmir in terms of occupational constitutionalism, where they see constitution being wielded, where they see courts and laws being wielded as means to detain a population that is seeking resolution to their problems under the United Nations resolutions as well. So that's something important to consider, that we do have to, when we think about Kashmir, we do have to shift our vantage from thinking about this being just an insurrection against India, but also India being an aggressive force that came into Kashmir in 1947. It did not come as a benefactor. That's what India wants people to know, and it has been harping on that for the last 72 years, but that's far from it. It is an aggressive occupation force inside Kashmir, and in that preventive detention, quote-unquote preventive detention, becomes very significant to their politics. It's legalized. And now what we see in the last 33 years, we see Armed Forces Special Powers Act that has been implemented. It de facto hands over the region to India, to the Indian military, Indian army. And it only applied to a certain region when the administration fails, when the government fails. So under that, you see the grave human rights violations that have occurred. And what has also occurred from 1989 onwards is enforced disappearances. Now, currently you have more than 10,000 plus disappearances of both combatants and non-combatants inside Kashmir. And these have been affected by the Indian army, Indian government forces, even the militia, the vigilante groups that have come up in the last 34 years. So, and on one hand, you have their enforced disappearances, just like many others that happen in the rest of the world, but you also see India calling them missing. And missing is kind of undermining the state violence, the state terrorism that is wreaked upon Kashmiri bodies. So I think that's where I will stop with the broader contextualization, and also thinking about the technology of torture as disappearance. And I know we'll talk more about it, but most important and more significant to the discussion here, to put everything in context, would be like, who is racialized in this disappearance? Who is this? Who is disappeared? It is the Kashmiri body, the Kashmiris, who are racialized to and discriminated to such an extent that anyone and everyone can be disappeared at any particular moment, and there is no redressal, there is no law. I personally, for the last 10 years, I have been working with an organization called Association of Parents of Disappeared Person. More than 10 years now. I finished my doctorate in 2014. That's when I kind of like, not stopped, but that was the time when I actively stopped working on the disappearances, and then the book came out after that. But the fact is, and disappearances have gone down massively, because now new technologies of torture are used. Now more it's mass blinding, it's mass detentions. So 90s were the time when disappearances were occurring most, and more than 10,000 have occurred till now. And what the APDP, the Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons, what they do is they are trying to look and searching for these disappeared men. And most of these disappeared are Kashmiri men. And several studies have shown that they are a certain kind of men. They are bearded men, they are Muslim bodies. And that's where you kind of see that otherization. Who are these people? In Kashmir, there is this fear that when a young boy starts getting older and they have a slight beard, their families will even the most religious families, they will want their little wards not to have beard, and they will ask them to shave it off, because there is a danger that if you look a certain way, if you dress a certain way, if you talk a certain way, you look like, quote unquote, what is stereotyped as a jihadi, as a Kashmiri aggressive terrorist, patriarchal Muslim Muslim men. And after 2001, it has become very, very easy to throw these people into this otherized category. And now after 2014, what we see happening inside India, not that Kashmir is not treated any differently after 2047, after the right-wing regime that is currently in the Hindu supremacist party that is in governance right now. Kashmir has always been this kind of a problem for India. They have always wanted to forcibly integrate it within its geo-body, but the methods were different. So the autonomy, Kashmir's autonomy, was diluted more than 12 times till 2019, but it was militarily in more brazen fashion done in 2019 by the BJP. And they are actually trying to, so the racialization, otherization of Muslim Kashmiri bodies had always been there, but now it's more brazen. Now it's more, because now they're also changing laws after 2019, after they abrogated the entire set of laws and they changed the land laws. What's happening currently is that Kashmir is open for business. It's open for all kinds of corporations. There is no say. There is no local administrative government currently. They have put up some, sort of like the hogwash of local democracy, very recently done some elections, but that is a far cry from having Kashmiris in governance. So the dispossession at the particular moment is is a huge issue. So that's how we have, and then there's also several laws that are in circulation, especially the Public Safety Act. Kashmiris call it the Public Unsafety Act, because this can be slapped on any Kashmiri for any, it might be a Facebook post, or it might be, outright saying something against India. Between the two, anyone can be incarcerated at any point in time, but we do have to keep in mind that preventive detention is very, very central to India's handling of Kashmiri dissidents and Kashmiri resistance, so to speak. So I think that's it.
Thank you so much, Ather. Thank you so much. Last but not least, Ahmed. I think you're still muted.
Now you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, I would like to thank you all for organizing this and for having me tonight with you. And I would like to begin my speech with what you mentioned in the introduction about the colonial element of the story of prisons in our lands. As if I go back in history to the beginning of the Republic of Egypt, after the coup of the military in 56, and this was the beginning of the Egyptians, or of an Egyptian government that exactly repeating the same strategy that the imperialism was using. So, and the prisons are always at the center of any oppression or any oppressive system. So, and this was forced disappearance, for example, during Nasser era and during Al-Sadat after that, and the Mubarak, was a very usual routine and strategy of the Egyptian regime. So, but at this time, we just didn't call it forced disappearance. We had other names for this practice, like for Egyptians, for example, it was just being sent behind the sun. They used this literal expression about the people who have been forced disappeared. And then during during Mubarak, the same strategy continued, but Mubarak was wanted to be a part of the international system. That's why he tried to make some superficial, good-looking system, democratic country. He had election, he had opposition. So he tried also to show the picture of respecting human rights in his relation and in his cooperation with the Western countries, just for the media use. And then after the coup in 2013, we are watching a new era in the Egyptian history. We have never had something like this before in the modern Egyptian history. Forced disappearance is one part of the dirty war, is one of the tactics that the Egyptian regime is using against this population who rebelled and said down to the system. So they are punishing the Egyptian people since 2013 till now. So this is a very big, far away picture about the environment, the political environment in Egypt. And as I said, prisons are the center of this oppressive machine that the Egyptian regime is using. And as a reflex, as a reaction, also prisons and what it all includes, because when we talk about prison in Egypt, we are talking about torture, enforced disappearance, death penalty. We are talking about unfair trial, military trials. So all of this is part of the prison story in Egypt and everywhere, I'm sure. But I'm just talking from the Egyptian perspective. And so it became in the center of the struggle against this oppressive system as well. So the Egyptian activists or revolutionary now are, most of their struggle is concentrated on and directed to the prison problem and the prisoners and forced disappearance and torture and so on. So this is how it looked like right now in like from the 2013 till 2019, the Egyptian regime has arrested and imprisoned more than 130,000 Egyptian. And of course, we are not talking about the mass trials and so on, and about the conditions in the prisons itself, as have been mentioned before, that myself was a political prisoner in a high security prison, which is called Scorpion 2 prison. And I don't think it's related at all to the carceral system in what we called, or what is being called the first world. That there's a big difference, and actually there is here also is the difference in Egypt itself. For example, the prisons in Egypt itself, there's prison, the whole condition of the prison in one place is completely different as in another place. So every individual experience is could be different. Yeah, this is again just a very short summary about the situation, the political situation in Egypt, and how the prisons playing the role of like the only space of struggle is the prisons, which is I don't know if it's a good thing or bad thing, but for me, the abolitionism in Egypt is still a very strange thing. Not even among the revolutionary themselves, the radical revolutionaries themselves, they are not able to process the idea of warlords without prisons, and how could be the prison itself as a very important tool for the oppressive state can be the center of the struggle. But unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, now in Egypt, prisons are the center of the struggle. And I think this is the chance where we can talk more about abolitionism in Egypt and try to attract people to join this discourse. So I think this is the good positive of the situation. And I think also what have been happening in USA, for example, and how the idea of abolishing the police and abolishing prisons becoming mainstream right now is also a very important historical moment from my point of view, that we all have to try to use it as much as we can and to get benefit from it and to invest in these ideas, and also to use its existence in the even in the mainstream media. I think I have said okay, I still have 2 minutes, and I would maybe use this 2 minutes to talk about also the health care as a part of the punishment process, how the Egyptian regime, for example, as an example of an oppressive system, using the health care as a punishment tool inside the carceral system in Egypt. The prisoner, especially the political prisoners in Egypt, are not getting the basic line of the health care in prison, and being right now in the center of this pandemic, making it more and more urgent to also talk about this topic and to try to raise awareness among even the activists themselves, the political activists themselves, and to try to learn from each other and to show our solidarity as learning. Learning also can be a very important solidarity tool. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. And Ahmed, I love where you ended, because that's kind of the next question that I'd like to ask all of you, is the question of solidarity. We've learned, and there's so much more time we could spend learning about the carceral technologies, the histories of the violence, which is not recent, it's much older, it has different kinds of temporalities, different kinds of reasons. These populations have different kind of relationships to the states that are causing this violence. But really the thing that I'd like to ask you all about now is about the political movements resisting this state violence specifically. Could you tell us a little bit about that, and perhaps reflect a little bit about what kinds of analyses, what kind of insights, what kind of critiques, and really what kind of social theory, political theory is emerging out of political dissidence movements, whether it's for separation or independence in some cases, or otherwise? What are they teaching all of you about globally circulating incarceration? And you know, related to that, how has the abolitionist movement, as it's come out of the US, helped you also understand and reassess and reevaluate what's going on in these different sites? I'd also like to, so I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions. I'd also like you to think and maybe share with us a little bit about what it would mean, you know, to build solidarities between movements in each of these sites, and a sort of a global, and GPAC, as Ed called it in the beginning. What would it mean to do the work of this coalition? And specifically, what does solidarity look like? What does a global prison abolition coalition look like between these different sites? What does it mean to take a political language and a political vocabulary of abolition? Again, in English, and we have, you know, different languages in each of these sites, different kinds of vocabularies. In Pakistan, for example, the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement has a mantra that is, Dasanga Azadida, what kind of freedom is this, which is part of the critique of the military state. So there's other kinds of vocabularies. What would it mean to think with the vocabulary and analysis of the abolitionist movement? So this time I am going to ask Ather to begin.
There are so many questions.
I know, I'm horrible.
Okay, so I think maybe I'll begin with what would it mean to build solidarity, because I think that's where Kashmiris are at the moment. We have 10 minutes. Is that what you're saying? Okay. So that is, so I have till 12. So what does solidarity mean to Kashmiris at the moment as they are going through what they're going through? and that is severe repression at the moment. If you think about Kashmir right now, many people are inside Kashmir. They are not, there's a lot of silence coming from Kashmir at the moment, but I don't like to see it as silence. I see, or maybe people being silent, but it's more like people are silenced because no one can speak. If you were to speak, if you were to write a Facebook post, you'd probably, the government doesn't like it, they'd throw you in jail. This is, censorship has always been one of the most preeminent things in Kashmir. People have self-censored themselves. There have been censor laws in different forms. But right now, what you see is censorship is institutionalized to the extreme. There's actually a law that was passed recently. It's equivalent of a media gag. So people, even journalists whose job is to report, they can't report at this particular moment. And if they do report, and if some bureaucrat who has been assigned the job of looking at these reports, they don't like it, they will either term it fake, they'll either term it as instigation to terrorism or saying something against state sovereignty, and they'll be thrown in jail. And Kashmir has several high-profile journalists, high-profile in the sense that because they have been incarcerated for the last 4 or 5 years. One of them is Asif Sultan, and one of them was recently released. But then we also saw a slew of charge sheets against various journalists who were just doing their job. So that is the current moment in Kashmiri politics. The other side of this is also what happened after 2019, 5th August, when the quasi-autonomy was taken away unilaterally and militarily, which India and Indians celebrated as conquering of Kashmir. It was not quote-unquote integration, what India has been looking for the last 72 years, diluting Kashmiri identity and diluting Kashmiri autonomy to an extent where they can be easily annihilated, where they can be easily incorporated. It wasn't done in that fashion because Kashmiris have been restive and they have been asking for their rightful voices to be heard for the last 72 years. So they still had to do it militarily. So Kashmir was under curfew for more than 7-8 months on off. Partial restrictions were there, but they were till October, late October, no one really knew what was happening inside Kashmir. There were mass detentions, and not just resistance and freedom leaders, but there were also the client politicians of India, which I earlier said, who had been carrying India's water for the last 72 years, whether old or young or new generations that are joining their forces. They were also detained. So there were more than, at one particular time, there were more than 13,000 detainees inside Kashmir, and many of them were young children. And no one was taking cognizance of what was happening. No one knew outside in the world what was happening. Genocide Watch also issued an alert, a genocide alert. Such was the situation. So international media was trying to report, but then they were also banned from going inside Kashmir. So at this particular moment, when you see Kashmiris under siege, all Kashmiris, not just the Kashmiris who want sovereignty, who want independence, or who want to accede to Pakistan, or the ones who are the client politicians inside Kashmir, all of them at this particular moment are under siege because the government of India, the way it's handling the politics, the way it is implementing its military occupation force, it's kind of unprecedented. They're coming from all sides. So there is no local administration. They have tried some local governance forms very recently through elections, but that's a different animal altogether. It's an experiment that they're doing and that they're using to tell the world that they're holding elections. So that is the current situation in Kashmir, that not even client politicians are able to speak. The moment they speak, the moment they talk about the autonomy or why it was taken away unilaterally, because they were for it, they are thrown into jails, they are under house arrest. And then there are several high-profile resistance leaders who have been under house arrest and who have been incarcerated. And one of them, Sayyid Ali Gilani, he has been under house arrest for the last, I think, more than a decade. He hasn't stepped outside his home. Currently, he's very, very sick. He's almost on his deathbed, but he's not released. He's not allowed. People are not allowed to go inside and to see him, or there's no mobility, so to speak. So that is what's happening in Kashmir at the moment. So at this particular juncture, solidarity, international solidarity becomes very important for Kashmiris. But how do we negotiate? How do we cross that bridge? What are the things that we need to keep in mind when we are offering or when we are trying to understand and establish this solidarity? What kind of solidarity will that be? What will the international community offer? What will an organization like Prison Abolition, not just organization, but this ethos offer Kashmir? I think we have to think in decolonial terms. We have to think about also the fact, as I said in our previous conversations, that decolonial praxis is very, very important. We have to think about the vocabulary. We have to think about the privilege of just thinking about a world without prisons. Because when we think about Kashmir, Kashmir is known as one of the most beautiful open air prisons. Because if you think about the laws, the draconian laws, the Disturbed Area Act, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, the Public Safety Act, the sheer presence of more than 700,000 military personnel inside Kashmir, soldiers, plus more than 100,000 police officials, heavily militarized, and also the militia. What are we talking about when we think about abolition inside Kashmir? So I think when we're talking about solidarity for Kashmiris, we're talking about solidarity to end prisons and incarceration and such penalization inside Kashmir. We're also thinking about the political turmoil. We're also thinking about the political conflict. We're also thinking about the veils of terrorism, the stereotype that has been put on the resistance for the last 72 years, and the way it's easily subsumed into as Pakistan's proxy war, as a territorial dispute, as a border dispute. So I think it's a layer of questions here that we have to cross, and we have to cross them, each of them, so that we are not doing any disservice to what's happening inside Kashmir. I'm not saying that abolishing prisons is not en masse a good and solid option, and that we should be doing, and we should be lending our support to. But at the same time, how do we do this for Kashmir? Because Kashmir is not just a black and white kind of a situation. No one is. All the situations that we're talking about are really, really complicated. But we can't really take the slogan and kind of look at Kashmir and think that this is going to help, because the prisons inside Kashmir are not even prisons that are identified. There might be several prisons that are identified, but there are more than 400 to 600 sites. We don't even know, because we don't have the numbers. Secret prisons. And then what about when houses become prisons? Like when there is a crackdown, when there is a raid happening in a certain area, there are several houses and schools which are designated as makeshift prisons, and you just throw people inside there, and that is what happens inside Kashmir. So how do we translate, how do we understand this ethos that has also a very Western vocabulary, and how do we kind of translate it, and how does that solidarity look like? How does that transmission happen? And what are the things that we need to do? And I think we also, as I said, we do have to adopt a sort of decolonial lens when we are looking at situations like Kashmir, and treat it as a very creative kind of arena for us to think with. And not just, I mean, disappearances is on one level. Like, they don't even need prisons for disappearances. They just a disappearance is, it's also a psychic prison for people, because that's what happened in the 90s. If there was a disappearance, it was a representative threat to the entire population that do not do this. And this was not even specified, because these were combatants as well as non-combatants. And as I said earlier, the studies showed that these were certain types of bodies. And Kashmiris know this very well. We don't need studies. As a Kashmiri scholar, we don't really need studies, because these are lived experiences. If you have a beard, you're wearing certain type of, or you're coming out of a masjid, you're coming out after prayers. You don't even need to have a beard, and someone is standing outside. They can apprehend the person, kidnap the person, and take them away. So how do we think about prisons in that kind of a situation where life in itself has become a camp? Kashmir is a de facto camp at the moment, and now a de jure camp as well. So that's my piece for this. I hope
Thank you so much. I think you really brought attention to one of the things I think a lot about in terms of Pakistan, which is that the very carceral institution, the prison itself, isn't, easily identifiable as this sort of always as this building. It isn't always available to us even for analysis or critique, because it either shows up everywhere, your house becomes it, or you don't know where it is. You have an invisibilization of these technologies of violence. And so even the act of documenting them sometimes and generating evidence, and Ather talks about this in her book, the making of archives that show that a disappearance has even taken place, becomes a radical act in a way that I don't think that it does in the Western world. So there are other kinds of conditions that we operate under. Thank you so much, Ather. Ahmad, we would love to hear from you.
I would like to begin with the solidarity thing. I just want to say, like, a very short sentence, that I think that every struggle everywhere are, even if it's not aware that it's a kind of solidarity to other people in a different places, it is a solidarity. So when I have been asked all the time, which kind of solidarity are the Egyptians in need for? My answer was, struggle against your governments who are supporting the dictatorships in our countries. So this is the kind of solidarity I think every struggling people in need for. Every group of people are struggling against oppression, are just facing different faces of the same oppressor. And this is my point of view. So, and to talk about Egypt, I think I have to begin from the revolution, January revolution in 2011, because this is like, it's at the beginning of a new era in Egypt. This revolution that happened 10 years ago, and we are talking exactly after 10 years. This is a coincidence, but it's already 10 years after the revolution, and we still living the defeat of the revolution. We are living the era of anti-revolution. This is what Egypt living since 2013, the anti-revolution era. And the anti-revolution from the Egyptians' leftists' point of view, or the radical or the revolutionary, they think that the anti-revolution is just not against the Egyptian regime, but also against the sponsors. And the sponsors of the Egyptian regime are mainly the Western countries and the Gulf countries, which we can call the capitalist governments or imperialist governments, new colonial or whatever. And so this is the solidarity I would like to have, for example, from my comrades or my people who want to be in solidarity in Germany, for example. I want them to stand against their own government and change their own system and deal with their own problems and stop sponsoring the dictatorship in our countries. This is for, I think, for most of us, are the optimal form of solidarity we would like to receive. About the resistance, I think that in Egypt, after the coup, with the beginning of this dirty war, that most of the Egyptian resistance is focused on human rights discourse. I think this is one of the main problems of the Egyptian opposition right now, that they are, again, just focusing on the human rights discourse. There's a lot of reasons to this. It's not just because they believe that would lead to somewhere, but they are forced just to be busy in this discourse. And the reasons behind this, for example, is that there is no space, there is no very little space on the ground in Egypt for any organizational work or organizing work. There's no space to move, to talk, to organize. There's no space, and the only space that the Egyptian found is in exile. So mostly the Egyptian activists are exiled or in prison or working from Egypt in human rights organizations, NGOs, which are under attack all the time. So they are, I would say that they are working against law in a sense, because they are being attacked all the time. People, activists being kidnapped, tortured, even killed, disappeared for years, and then sentenced for years, also in prison after unfair trials. So the only available space for the Egyptians are in exile. So also because even the virtual space or the cyberspace is also being occupied by the security agents or surveillance, like also like they also arrest people because of what they write on social media and so on. So this is one of the reasons why mainly it's a human rights discourse, and there's a lot of problem in human rights discourse. Mainly what you mentioned before is the language. The language of human rights discourse itself is have been designed to preserve and keep the status quo all the time. So it is against changing or positive development in any situation. So and this is one of the problems of the human rights. So Egyptians are trying to go through this discourse to gain some kind of international pressure or diplomatic pressure on the Egyptian regime to release one prisoner, two prisoners, three prisoners. It's always about individuals, and it's always about the privileged individuals who have, and privilege here in this context means the people who have direct connection and relation to the Western context, people who knows a Western politician or have connection to the Western media. This is all what it is in the human rights discourse, especially the Egyptian right now. And there's also another form of resistance, and there's a lot of forms of resistance, I would say, and we can see this all the time, also especially in the online. This is what we can see. There's a lot of trials people tried, like even till the last year, we have seen people being demonstrated on the street, but they are not organized. They have no connections to each other. So the resistance would be all the time very weak to form a real form of power that can pressure the Egyptian regime to adopt any kind of a change or developments. There's something else I wanted to talk about, actually. I think also, like, I wanted to, maybe the last thing to talk about, but I mean, as we talked about language, I have wrote like a small booklet about the language of prisons as a form of resistance. Actually, like the Egyptians political prisoners having their own language with its own logic, and actually it's a very clear form of rebellious and revolt against the society and the society rules. But also, when we talk about language, we have to think about the language power dynamic, and we talked about the decolonization, and us right now even using the English language is a sign of the disease of the system that we are facing. I mean, like, part of the human rights discourse is based on creating messengers between the victims or the survivors of the oppressions and the people who have the power or the policymakers. And human rights advocates are playing in this era. They are the messengers. So they take the complaint of the people and to translate it into the international accepted language and then send it to the policymakers. And in MENA Prison Forum initiative, we are trying to bring the words of the survivor themselves and represent it as it is, discussing their own problems and discussing the solutions that they think of as a solution for their own problems. But this is just a side note. And thank you.
Thank you. I think and imagine that this is a massively shared problem about how liberal human rights language becomes the legible language for missing persons movements and other movements everywhere, to sort of very quickly bring attention to a disappearance. And when you're operating in the urgent situations that you do in Kashmir, that we do in Pakistan, that in Egypt, then you don't have time to sort of do all of the longer political work, which is why this alliance is so important, I think. Last, but definitely not least, Vincent, and I'm going to throw a question at you also from one of our audiences around the question of international solidarity by Paul Sullivan. Vincent, do you have thoughts on building international solidarity against PRC's carceral imperial state in Xinjiang while still rejecting the US's own carceral imperial state? Westerners especially seem to have difficulty with being able to reject both instead of a which side are you on approach between the two powers.
Yeah, thanks so much for the amazing question, Paul. And I also note Cortland Chan's question, also very excellent and along the same lines and naming names, right? We're talking about tankies here. So I was so excited by listening to Ather and Ahmed, discussing some of these like critiques, and I hope to build on some of them. And I'll also address hopefully the questions along the way. So I'm going to be like painting with the brush, and then like hopefully at the end of like 10 minutes of whatever the hell I say, you'll see like a picture emerge. Okay. So I want to start with the idea of solidarity, right? And because we're in this space, I want to specifically add a qualifier to solidarity, which is abolitionist solidarity. So what does that mean? It means something different, right? It means something different both in framing and in praxis. So solidarity is obviously very important, but when we think about exactly what we're talking about, we need to be clear on that and why, right? So I will first talk a little bit about the international solidarity for Xinjiang and the campism issue. So public opposition, so similar to Ather's situation in Kashmir and to a certain extent in Egypt as well, right? Public occupation within Xinjiang is effectively impossible, right? You have really this like total system of unfreedom, and you can't really hide from a comprehensive grid policing system, an AI-enabled system, right? Those who have opposed have long since been detained or disappeared or imprisoned or re-educated or punished in some way. So the public resistance, where does it go? And it's just like Ahmed said, the public resistance happens publicly, right, in the diasporas, in the exiled communities, and their allies who seek to defend their human rights. But then you run into the hegemony of liberal human rights discourse and praxis. So I would say human rights solidarity, like as a traditionally formed, is different from abolitionist solidarity. So I would just note that at the beginning. And so what is it about the prison abolitionist movement that we, has kind of grown out of US and a lot of Black radical thinking, and its insights into racial capitalism, settler colonialism, and abolition instead of reform? What did these bring to the struggle? And I would say that this brings a completely generative and different lens, right? And this is exactly the lens that we need and the vocabulary that we need to understand what is happening in China to break away from campism, right? That what is happening in Xinjiang is part and parcel of the same system that is what is happening in the rest of the world in terms of hard right shifts, right? And to break down the system as a part of a global system of racial capitalism and settler colonialism, as Ahmed said, this is the different faces of the same oppressor, right? I think that was so critical. And so the liberal human rights language really only tells us about the tip of the iceberg, right? What is the consequence? It doesn't properly give us the frames and vocabulary to articulate why it is happening and how to organize as a mass, as a people against it, right? As opposed to appealing to primarily Western human rights professionals, diplomats, media, et cetera, right? And framing your opposition discourses into something that is palatable for these folks, right? And so it's that liberal language and the appealing to the West that always allows competing nationalisms to play off against each other. And so directly going back to, I think, is it Paul? Paul's question, what does Xinjiang then tell us about global state violence and global carcerality, right? The one is conceptual holes in the Western post-colonial and third world solidarity theory, right? And for this, I'm going to piggyback off Kashmiri scholar Nitisha Kaul's work, in that we have a conceptual gap in that we're always structuring colonial power between the West and the non-West. And there's no place for perceiving a colonial exercise of power by non-West states, right? Unless it is reflective of a divide and rule agenda of the West. And this is a significant problem. Xinjiang, understanding it in that way, provides a lens in which to break down this conceptual problem. Two is the recycling of war and terror and securitization and settler colonial logic. And going back to what Ahmed was saying about Egypt post 56, you see the recycling and the reifying of the same colonial tools of oppression and carcerality within the new state, right? So that's a way to break through break through this sort of campism that sort of happens. And non-Western states always saying that, oh no, we need these like massive prisons because of the threat of the West, and these are like decolonial prisons or whatever the hell it is, right? And then the last thing I'll say is to think about like what is the circulation of private mass surveillance technology. So Xinjiang is a key testing ground in this, right? Because China is trying to become, along with the US, a leader in the terror capitalism industry, right? And it laid the blueprint for this all-encompassing racist system of mass surveillance and predictive policing that is being corporatized and then sold to other countries like Ecuador that now have a turnkey mass surveillance system and facial recognition system to do their own carceral work, right? So again, this is how global carcerality is directly connected, right? And then so what do we do? What is solidarity? What does abolition solidarity mean? How are we doing with time? It does a couple of things, right? So I'll break it down into three things. One is the solidarity of framing. So that is if you're able to understand and conceptualize the interlocking systems of oppression, so racial capitalism, carcerality and securitization, imperialism, patriarchy, then this itself weakens the power. It automatically weakens the power of those systems simultaneously because they thrive on these fictions that divide and divide oppressed peoples, right? The framing itself automatically weakens the justificatory power of these systems. That's one. Two, I think it's important that the solidarity value the praxis and the lived experience of those who are most affected by decarceration and decolonization, and have their carceration and colonization, and have them articulate their struggles and their experiences in their views, right? And without translating them necessarily into something that would be digestible for a Western audience. So there's a lot of work we can do in that end. And then the third one is like actual action, right? And that's where we can think about how can we organize these things together through a declarative solidarity, joining direct action. So the idea of having like a protest circuit, not only protesting oppressions in one place, but actually doing a circuit of different places where there is a common theme. labor and union solidarity. So I just want to give a shout out to Uyghur Solidarity Network that is really about labor solidarity in the Xinjiang context. And what we're doing here, right, sharing information, tactics, and ideas as across different struggles is a very, very important part of that solidarity. So I just want to wrap it up by just saying what we're trying to build is difficult, but it is a no one left behind politics at its furthest, right? It is an intersectional justice politics taken to its deepest form. I think that is what we're trying to build. And it's really hard because there's no real precedent for it, right? But this is the time. So I'll just wrap it up there.
Thank you so much. There are both a lot of wonderful comments and questions in the audience, but I'm going to throw one out quickly, and anybody is welcome to pick up on it. And that's the issue that Vincent, you brought up, the necessity of centering the lived experiences of the people who are really subject to these carceral technologies. In a lot of the places that each of you are talking about, there is existing histories of resistant politics. Some of these places are calling for self-determination. In Pakistan, in southern Pakistan, in Balochistan, the current demand there is actually for separation and the creation of a new state with its own set of borders and potentially also its own policing and militarism. And liberal human rights politics does have a place, both it is a language that circulates in these communities, as do a series of others, including an Islamist imaginary in some of them. So abolition is just one of the political discourses that, or ideas that could circulate among all of these others. And so what would it mean to take something like abolitionist politics and talk about it in these contexts? And I'm specifically thinking of it, for example, in the case of Pakistan. One of the very, very careful things that every missing persons movement does is that they say, we are going to uphold the constitution and the law of this country. We respect its military and its police institutions, and we just want to have our time in court. How can you talk about abolition in one of those places? And I think there was a wonderful question by, I believe, Usman Khan, which speaks to this, where he says, if open resistance is not possible in the face of state oppression, then how can we get the results by resistance? How can we do this organizing? Anybody is welcome to pick up on this question. Yeah, Ahmad, go ahead.
Just to make sure, if open resistance is, thank you. I would, I like to ask about the question. Can I see the question again? Sorry. Yes. If open resistance is not possible in the face of a state oppression, then can we get the results? Then can we get the results by resistance in this area? Yes.
So I think like underground or in other ways.
I'm not sure if I understand the question, but I'm just having a comment on the expression of open resistance. I mean, like it's let's make it like a kind of metaphoric. I think it's the oppressive systems all the time using the fear weapon against the people. They want to make the people afraid all the time to move, to revolt. And the same weapon they use to produce fear can produce anger. The same weapon, and fear and anger is a very, very, even physiologically, they are very similar feelings. So what the regime, the oppressive regime, is using as a tool of oppression can be a tool to stimulate revolting against the regime itself. It's always this dialectical character of the oppression. It stimulates revolt, at the same time it tries to oppress. So when I was talking about the Egyptian situation, for example, I have said that there's no space to work, there is no space to organize. But I can assure you that there's people who are trying to overcome the space, to claim the space, and to organize. and using every little chance. And it's just as a snowball, and it takes its time. And after 10 years of the revolution, a regime as the Egyptian regime is still afraid of what happened, is still afraid of the fresh memory, is trying to use all much possible violence against the population to make them afraid of revolt again, and to punish them for asking for the rights once. And this is also another sign that they are still not stable regime, and that they will never be stable in the coming presence. And this is also one of the reasons why the Western countries are still sponsoring this regime. They claim all the time that they are trying to preserve the stability, the political stability of the region. But what they are doing, they are really fooling the instability all the time through this support of the regime. And also, if we see globally, not just locally, because the Egyptian revolutionaries, for example, learned it hard, that they learned that there is no such a thing called local revolution. They have learned that revolution has to be international. So this is one of the big lessons that we have been learned. And yeah, this is so if we see, as I said, that globally, we can see all these chains of revolting all over the global. Latin America, even North America, Africa, Asia, even Europe, all these chains of revolts are saying that the global is revolting. It's not just a local revolution. It's not a business of one population, not a business, just a business of one country. It's a global thing. Thank you.
Can I just add a little? Do we have time? How much time do I have to answer?
Take a few minutes, and we still have 15 minutes left for our session.
So I just wanted to briefly, I don't know which part I would be answering, but just to build on a couple of things that Ahmed had said and Vincent had said earlier, thinking regarding Kashmir and thinking of solidarity in a very international sense, or the way we are talking about currently, I feel like we do have to take the decolonial element into consideration, because we've been talking about language a lot. We've been talking about, as Ahmed said, that there's no local revolution. I really like it. It has to be international. And we have talked about this previously, just thinking about our own positionalities in this solidarity ethos. Like, who are we as people who are trying to think about solidarity? Currently, I'm part of this settler horde right here in the United States, in the US academe, and many of the universities also have stocks in the kind of businesses that are fueling problems elsewhere. So we have to take that into consideration as well. And the problem of language is really deep. And I feel like as more and more, initially solidarity, international solidarity, it really is a very tempting idea that at local level we are doing something, but then if we get some international help, and then that's somehow amplifies us. But then that also brackets us, because it's not as if Kashmir has not received international solidarity. Let's take the disappearances. Currently, there is 2 APDPs functional in Kashmir, the Association for Parents of Disappeared Persons, and one of the, I think AFAD, I forget the name of I forget the full acronym, but you could say the International Organization for Disappearances, AFAD, Association of Federation of something. I'm sorry, I don't know the full acronym. But the president is a Kashmiri person. He's a human rights defender as of now. So the disappearances have had international solidarity, so to speak. So that's one part of the equation. But the fact is that it's not been difficult either to get solidarity from Indian activists when we are thinking about Kashmir as a human rights issue. But the problem is when we start thinking about it as a political issue, that the disappearances will go away once we are resolving it politically, then it becomes a problem. So people will throw their weight behind you when you say that, oh, Kashmir is a human rights problem, let's take OFSPA away, let's stop the army. There are many people who want to throw their weight behind you. But the moment you say, it's not just this, Kashmir is not just a human rights issue, then it becomes a different ballgame altogether, and you lose so many of the people who had come forth with their solidarity. So I feel like there's something to be thought about in that regard as well. How do we, are we just connecting with the language of human rights here? Are we thinking beyond human rights as a decolonial praxis as well? Thinking about our own positionalities, as I said earlier, who are we as scholars, as settler scholars inside United States, for me, per se, and then talking about Kashmir as a human rights and a political issue. Then also thinking about what are the symbolics that we are deploying in our solidarity. For example, United Nations, so to speak. For many Kashmiris, United Nations is a shorthand to tell the rest of the world that this is a problem. It's a resistance issue. It's not a terrorism issue. It becomes a shorthand. And also it's an issue of self-determination, because United Nations has mandated that, promised that to Kashmiri people. But at the same time, United Nations in itself is seen as this colonial legacy, as a neo-colonial sort of hegemon, so to speak, where only a few countries get to speak, and the countries that have military and political girth on the in geopolitics, they get to speak. What happens to the rest of us? So I think there's something to be thought about regarding our own positionalities, for me to begin with, and thinking about decolonial praxis. Sometimes I ask myself, like, how did I have to come here to think about all this, get all this vocabulary, and then think how useless this vocabulary becomes when you're trying to think about the problems that you are thinking of and writing about. And I think that's the dead end where I'm at, and that's why this conversation is very important to me personally. Like, how do I think about Kashmir in terms of tangible solidarity, and also cross the hurdle of thinking about it only as a human rights problem, and human rights problem that is that is the vocabulary given to me by the hegemons of neocolonialism. So yeah.
I just want to add 2 points very close related to what Ather just said. Actually, the human rights, the international human rights system is a colonial system. It's how it works. And as I said, again, the human rights discourse is aiming to keep the status quo all the time as much as they can. And this is how it designed, even the language itself. And so when we are talking about solidarity, because I talked before, I gave an example how it works with diplomatic pressure, and this is our aim to reach the policy makers. And so we are just surrendering to the system again and again and again. And as exactly you said, I don't expect any kind of solidarity from the governments, from the imperial governments. This is not the people I'm waiting from solidarity for. Human rights discourse is aiming for this, but not me. This is not my aim. My aim is you people. My aim is the people who are listening to us right now. This is the people who I'm aiming to have solidarity from, and also giving solidarity. This is us. And the first step is to realize who are us, who are allies, who are our enemy. So as again, I want to repeat it again, our enemy is just one enemy. It is the system. It has multiple faces, but and multiple manifestations, but it's still at the end, it's a connections of capitalists or war people that control all the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vincent.
Yeah, wow, this is super powerful, and this is I mean, that's exactly it. I will try to talk a little bit about the issue of challenges of exporting abolitionist language that started, you could say, in the States, elsewhere, even when we think it's very productive. just like massive pushback that you're going to get in trying to get. And then this has been the case, for me personally, having written, quite a bit of abolitionist kind of analysis of the Hong Kong situation, right? Like it's not always like it's most frequently dismissed for various reasons, and we'll talk a little about that. So I was thinking about like one question is, what is the role and positionality of the diaspora if the homeland is facing massive urgent oppression, right? And this is a common issue among many diaspora, right? And I think that the positionality is actually different, and that it should be recognized in that way, right? Because if you are outside the homeland and outside the immediate oppression, your positionality is actually like different, right? You're easily more in community with other people from around the world, right? Frequently there's a little bit more space to actively resist without being like targeted, right, by the police. And so it feels different, and the vocabularies you're exposed to are different. So I think after we were having a discussion about this before, but like, the diaspora, one of our roles is to really listen and build community with other folks, because it's easier for us to do so. And that should be part of the function of information gathering, of gaining new ideas and vocabularies, and then sharing it, and then vice versa, right? Like getting that, providing that bridge function and explaining the struggle locally to an international audience. So that is, but you actually get, it actually becomes different. So like in the case of Hong Kong and broader China, to be specific, is there was a lot of discussion about this abolition language is from the West. But if you really think about it, it is about from people who are subjected to third world treatment inside the West for centuries, right? This didn't come from, I don't know, Eleanor Roosevelt or whatever, right? This came from the struggle of decades of centuries of chattel enslavement, from settler colonialism, the stealing and genocide of indigenous peoples, their cultures and their lands. So, we have to think about, what that means in terms of the actual praxis that it could provide, the generative emancipatory function that it could provide for people in various struggles in their homelands, right? So and we think about the history of it, like the historical fight for against slavery, for civil rights, anti-apartheid. Did that not shake the world? Like, it wasn't just situated in South Africa. It wasn't just situated in the British Empire and the United States, right? It shook the world. And so we have to think about that. The last thing I will say is in doing abolition solidarity, how important it is to import a class analysis to transnational solidarity, and start breaking down this bridge between political prisoners, right, that are the darlings of Western NGOs and liberal human rights discourse, and socioeconomic prisoners, the prisoners of poverty, the prisoners, and abolitionist language really centers that. And that's so powerful, right? And we're talking about prison abolition, we're talking about prisoner solidarity, right? You have to talk about class and the various oppressions that lead to a disproportionate exposure to poverty and its violences, in addition to the political prisoner part, right? So that's the generative power that abolitionist literature and praxis can I think share with a lot of these struggles.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Vincent and Ather and Ahmed. We're going to be wrapping up now, even though the conversation I feel like has just begun. But I'd like to invite all of the people that have listened in today to visit the website for the Global Prison Abolitionist Coalition and the Facebook page. I'd also like to say that I think a lot of really important points were brought up here at the end. And I just kind of want to summarize them quickly. One was around the question of, I guess, traveling theory and ideas of abolition going from, conditions emergent from from various communities within the U.S. who, like you say, have lived under third world or third world-like conditions, and going outwards, but also the importance of trying to get some of the ideas that are emerging in other parts of the world to also travel back, and the difficulty and complexities of diaspora politics. One of the questions that came up in terms of Pakistan that constantly comes up is that Islamophobia is a big issue for the Pakistani diaspora. But within Pakistan, the big issue is both military violence, but also militant violence. And that can't really be ignored because of the mass levels of attacks that sometimes happen. And there isn't a solution to that coming out of the West. It needs to be articulated within that context. And I think also the question of very practically building the solidarities. So moving beyond, we didn't really get into it, but really the question of moving beyond petition and declarations, which is really the point where we can get to. Like what, and one of the really constant issues that I keep on thinking about is how I see how, especially minoritized groups within post-colonial countries, kind of have a tendency to think strategically and be like, my enemy's enemy is my friend. And there's very problematic and difficult kinds of alliances that happen because they're in difficult and tight situations. But how do you get out of that? And what exactly does it mean other than us sitting here and declaring solidarities between these struggles? And a lot of these things still have to be worked through. So we are hoping to continue these set of conversations in the future. We're hoping to hold more public events and possibly also more private conversations. And if you're interested in getting involved with the coalition, please get in touch. Thank you so much. Thank you to our three speakers.